and also, all right, and also streaming live on Facebook. Okay, live on Facebook. All right, so we are live. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Lady Jane Aqua, and I'm playing double roles here, providing technical support as well as facilitating this conversation. Okay, so welcome to the Together We Heal Forum. It is a forum organized by the Central Texas African American Family Support Conference and Integral Care. This conference hopes to provide mental health awareness for the Black community as well as the community in general. We hope that this forum will provide the opportunity for you to participate in conversations that offer education, encouragement, and mental health resources. It is a 1 hour that we are going to chat in an open space, and so we hope that you will all help us do this. Please keep your audios muted. There will be time for all of us to unmute and have this conversation. Right, admitting folks. If there's a moment where you are overwhelmed with what we are talking about, Integral Care has a 24-hour helpline. The number is 512-472-4357, and I'm going to put this in the chat. So if you feel overwhelmed, you're welcome to call Integral Care and you'll be attended to. Please know that we are streaming live on Facebook, so smile. Well, today's conversation is about children's mental health. And as you all know, May is Children's Mental Health Awareness Month. Here to have this conversation with us is Dr. LaShanda Lewis. She's a Director of Counseling Services at Round Rock ISD. As a director, Dr. Lewis oversees the district's social and emotional learning, teen parent program, children development centers, and elementary, middle, and high school counselors. Dr. Lewis is involved in work with the regional and state levels to promote mental health and the work of school counselors. She is the Director of Advocacy for the Lone Star State Council Association. Welcome, Dr. Lewis, and we appreciate you all for being here. So, this is a conversation, no PowerPoint. So everybody dig in. If you have any comments, any questions, please put it in the chat and there'll be time for us to engage in that way. Dr. Lewis, the last few years has been very rough on everyone, adults and children alike. Now we are always talking about mental health. So why is it important for us to understand our own mental health and that of our children?
Well, thank you. Thank you. I want to say first, thank you for allowing me to have this conversation. And like you mentioned, this is a month in which we recognize mental health, not only for us adults, but also how it impacts our children, our students. And this is something that, you know, for years has been a conversation has been stigmatized. We don't often talk about this. So thank you for everyone that is here today to hear this information and for being an advocate for mental health. It's extremely important that we are all advocates, not only just for our physical health, but for our mental health. And so I think that's where I take that question is that, you know, when we are sick physically, we don't question that. Where you start to have a cold, you start to have a runny nose, you actually go out and you get medicine for it, you get treatment for it. If you feel like you are too sick to the point where you can't do the care in your home, then you actually go to the doctor and seek that help. And why we want our mental health to be treated the same way. And I think sometimes we forget that just like our physical health, our mental health is on a spectrum. You know, we may have a little cough, we may have a little runny nose, but we may, as many of us have probably experienced or had someone experience in recent years, can go all the way down the spectrum to where you were with an ailment like COVID or the flu or something like that. And our mental health is the same way. It's on this spectrum. And the more we can learn about it, the more we can recognize where we fall on that spectrum, the quicker we're going to be able to get ourselves support. But then also when we're talking about our children, the faster we're going to be able to connect them to support as well. And I found this statistic that I wanted to share since we are the Central Texas African American Family Support Conference. I wanted to share this information because I thought it was really interesting. So there are 13.4% of our US population identifies as Black or African American. Of those, over 16% report having a mental illness in the past year. So within the last 12 months, 16% of those individuals, which really equates to 7 million people, so 7 million Black or African American people in the last 12 months has reported having a mental illness. And so to think about that in terms of population, that is more than the population of Chicago, Houston, and Philadelphia combined. So when you think about those very large cities, again, we're just talking about African Americans, and we're only talking about the people who actually responded to this survey that was sent out. That number of people have reported in the last year some type of mental illness. And so when we start to think about how prevalent that is, but how often people seek help, we want to make sure that those 7 million people are actually reaching out and getting help as well. And we know that that's not always the case. So that's why it is really important that we talk about mental health. That's why we talk about it's important that we understand it for ourselves as adults, but also why we understand it for our kids as well. Because if they see us struggling as adults and not being able to properly connect those tools and resources to get our self-support, then they're not going to learn those strategies and how to support themselves as well.
Well, thank you. That's quite a lot to take in. But I know we take time off to get help from diabetes or high blood pressure, but not for our mental health. We don't even want to admit that it's a possibility that whatever we're going through, whether it's depression or loneliness of some sort, or there's long drawn sadness that you can't explain, we just don't want to admit it. And when you do, judging eyes. So you rather keep quiet. But I want to follow up, talking about our children again. How do we talk to our children about their mental health when we haven't even figured out? How do we talk to our children?
Yes, absolutely. And you're right. Sometimes we can be very we want to avoid that situation. We want to avoid those conversations. But I would say, just like anything else that we do in life, most of us want what better for our kids than we want for ourselves. And so, yes, absolutely, you need to be taking care of your mental wellness as well. But I say for our students, for our kids, we need to start having those conversations. And it starts just like everything. It starts when they're so little that they don't even know what you're talking about, right? So if you have little kids at home, start talking to them about their feelings and let them know that whatever feeling they have is valid, so you can help them to navigate how to express those feelings in a healthy way, but then also helping them to reach out to mom, dad, aunt, uncle, big brother, sister, whoever, when whatever they're feeling is more than they can handle. So really starting those conversations early. And then if we're talking about kids that are a little older, maybe our teenagers, just start the conversation. And I always tell people, we as adults want the kid to sit down in front of us and start talking to us. But they may not be in a place where they feel comfortable, especially if you've never had that conversation before, but they may not even be in a place where they can really articulate what's going on. So, most of our kids probably carry around one of these, their cell phone, right? And so what I tell parents is, maybe you send them a text message and just say, how are you feeling today? how are you doing today? And allow them to actually respond to you via text. It can be extremely hard to have a conversation like that face to face, because the child is also feeling, well, are they going to judge me? Am I going to get in trouble? One thing we hear a lot in our school system is, I don't want to be sent away. If I tell my mom or my dad that, this is happening to me, they're going to send me away to a hospital and I'm going to be all by myself. So really start having those conversations, but having them in a way that is where your child is able to receive them is going to be extremely important. But then also help them to recognize that, you know what, I may be an adult, but I may not know all the answers for you. We're going to have to, be partners in helping you to get the support that you need. And I, as your adult in your life, will reach out and find the resources that you need. I think it's also important to let the child know that, or to not try to fix the problem for them. When you think about when you go to a friend or when you go to a colleague, and sometimes you just need to say what's on your chest, you don't want them to actually resolve it for you. You just want to kind of lift that burden. And sometimes that's what our students, our kids need from us, is to just have a safe place to just let all of that stuff that they have been carrying around inside just out. So I guess in short, in brief, start the conversation, whether that is you sitting across the table from them, whether you're chit-chatting on the way to soccer practice or football practice, or whether you're sending them a text message, just really just checking in on them. Start the conversation.
Well, it's good to know we have to have this conversation, but how do we start it? How do we start it?
Well, I think I said earlier, how do you feel? How are you feeling today? I think we ask our kids often, how was school today? Was it good? And they give us out, yeah, I was okay. But change that question up, like, how do you feel? I also, in my own personal life, I have two kids. I have a fifth grader and an eighth grader, and they don't know this. So I hope they're watching, but then I hope they're not watching, because they're going to learn my secret. But by the nature of the work that I do, I sometimes come home and I say, you know what, I saw this today, and and I give them a scenario of what I experienced at work. And then I want them to kind of help me learn what they would do in that situation. Or I may see something on TV. We have probably more conversations about suicide and self-harm in our home than probably most families do. But I think that's extremely important. And those can be extremely hard conversations, not only for me as a parent, but also for my kids to have. And so I'm like, oh, I was watching on TV the other day, and I saw this young person, and they were cutting themselves. Have you ever known anyone who has done that? Have you ever thought of something like that? Well, what do you think about that in general? And really helping to bring them into the conversation when it's not solely about them. Because when it's about them, it can be more difficult for them. So any way you can get into that conversation is important.
Awesome. This is something that just came to mind. What about parents or people who just think that talking about mental health will put the ideas in their kids' head? What about
Yeah.
that?
And we hear that a lot. Like, don't talk to my child about suicide, because you're going to put that thought in their head. And the reality is, if you don't ask when you suspect something, you're suspecting it for a reason. So there's some signs there. And by not asking, whether it's, are they harming themselves? Are they possibly doing drugs or alcohol? Have they had thoughts of suicide or made attempts? If you're asking those questions, you probably have seen some signs to make you think that that's a possibility. And by not asking, then you're potentially delaying help for that individual. But then we may have a consequence, or we may have a situation where that person's no longer with us because we were too afraid to ask. So if you are a parent or someone tells you, don't ask my child that question, or don't ask that question, ask yourself, what would you rather have? Would you rather have that conversation and it'd be really difficult, or would you rather deal with what may happen if you don't get that information from your child? Asking your child if they're thinking about suicide is not going to make them go out and want to harm themselves or die by suicide. I ask my kids about cleaning their room, and sometimes they don't go clean their room. So, it doesn't put that thought in their head. It really does elicit information that you may need. But then it also says, you know what, to that child, it says, you know what, oh, that person is thinking about that. And cares enough about me to ask that question. Maybe this is a person I can go to when I really am struggling.
Well, thank you for that. It's something that I've heard a lot about. So moving on, when should I seek help for my child?
So I think short answer is when you think you need to get help for your kid. Going back to when we talk about our physical health, when we feel like whatever we're seeing in our child physically is more than we can do, then we take them to the doctor, right?
Right.
And so, in short, the same thing when we're talking about our mental wellness or our children's mental wellness. If you start to see marked changes in your child that are not typical of your child, but are also not developmentally typical, especially when we're talking about teenagers, they get moody, they want to be by themselves more often. But if that is outside the realm of what maybe you have seen in your other children, or maybe your nieces or nephews, start to ask some questions and ask your kid's doctor, hey, is this typical of this age group? Have conversations with your child's teacher, have conversations with your child's school counselor, because a lot of times these individuals will have more information than you think they have, because they also see your child in a different light. So if you feel at any time that, well, I said, if you see things that are starting to change, if you're starting to worry, then definitely seek help. But the three things that I always tell parents: if their sleeping pattern changes drastically, whether it's they're not going to sleep at night, and truly not going to sleep at night. Sometimes they may say they didn't sleep, but they've been asleep, but they're not going to sleep, or they're sleeping way too long. Again, sometimes that's developmentally appropriate. If their eating habits have changed drastically one way or the other, and you are able to rule out maybe a growth spurt or a sickness, a physical sickness, or they're starting to be withdrawn, or their grades are starting to they've been an A student, their grades are all of a sudden falling. When something drastically changes in your child, that's a warning sign that something is going on. Doesn't always mean that it's a mental health related, but something is going on that you should want to address. And then also, if their personality or their behavior starts to change, maybe they're more withdrawn or they're more sad, and this is lasting for about 2 weeks or more, then you want to actually go ahead and reach out to your doctor to make sure there's not something else going on there.
Thank you. Follow-up question. Where do we seek help? Where do we start? The question says, should we go to the pediatrician or straight to find a therapist?
I always think you need to start with your pediatrician. And I will even tell you, 5 years ago, if you would have asked me, I probably would have said you need to go to your therapist. But what we're learning, or seek a therapist, what we're learning is that especially coming off COVID, there's a lot of things that happen in our body that can actually trigger some symptoms of depression, and other type of mental illnesses. But sometimes that can actually be because of maybe a deficit of some of the stuff that's in our body. So I would always say, go to your pediatrician first, maybe ask for blood work to make sure that everything is going well with your child physically. And then once you've gotten those answers that things are right physically, start having that conversation about, well, should I have my child see a therapist? And then start looking out for a therapist. I'm also a proponent that everyone could benefit from a counselor. So a counselor or a therapist or anything like that, because we all have stuff in our lives that we're trying to overcome, that we need to work through. And so I don't think there's ever any harm in having your child go talk to someone, even if they're not on the part of the mental health spectrum where they really need that type of support.
Thank you. Quick question here. As somebody says, what if my child doesn't need help or doesn't want help? I think that's what they wanted to say.
Yes. And sometimes, that can be really hard because we can't force our kids to do anything as much as we want to believe that as parents. Our kids, people in general, they have options. And so you either do it or you don't. And I think because of the stigma around mental health and the stigma around going to a therapist, it can be really difficult for children, especially. I think if you have a child that you feel and that you have the signs that say, my child really needs help, start with the conversation about why we are doing this. But then I would also make sure that you're listening to your child as to why they're not wanting to go get help. If they feel like, oh, I don't need this, then I think that's more conversations, but I would not give up on that. If you have all the warning signs that say your child is headed in a place where they're not going to be well, if they don't get this support that they need, continue to take them to their therapist. Sometimes it can just be fear because this is new to them. I'm having to go talk to this person that I don't know. They may feel as if that person doesn't understand them. But I also think that sometimes as adults, we feel like all therapists are created equal and all therapists are a fit for each individual. I know I talked a lot about, physical health and physical wellness, and we go to our doctor, but usually our interaction with our doctor is very brief, right? When someone goes to a therapist or to a counselor or a social worker, those are relationships that they're creating. And those relationships have to be a good fit in order for that individual that's seeking help to get the help that they need. And sometimes it may not be a good fit. For little kids, play therapy is probably the best route to go. And for children who are developmentally at a place where play therapy may help. I think sometimes we default to our chronological ages. So if I have a 18-year-old, most people may think, oh, well, let's go take them to talk therapy. But if they're functioning at a level where they're maybe developmentally an early youth, so 5, 6, or 7, play therapy may actually still be best for them. And so getting your child connected to the right form of help is going to be best always. And sometimes that takes you going to multiple locations and multiple places until you find that. And that may be some of the pushback that you're getting from your child.
Thank you. Follow-up question from the audience. What if I don't want my child medicated?
Absolutely, you have that right. And sometimes medication is not best for everyone. I would say if your child has been going to their doctor and maybe they have been seeing their therapist and those individuals have suggested some type of medication for your child, have those conversations with them about why they feel like that medication is going to be best for your child, but then also follow up with the question of what are the alternatives to medication. Sometimes it's dieting, and not dieting as in trying to lose weight, but really watching what you feed your child, watching what they eat. There are some holistic medicines that are more natural that your child could take. But yes, absolutely. If you don't want your child to have medication, by no means, I would hope that a therapist or a psychiatrist would not force your child to do so, but do have those conversations about what are the alternatives to taking medication for my child. But I would also say, make sure you have the conversation about what would the benefits be for my child on medication, but also what would be the side effects if my child were on medication. And I know sometimes when medication is prescribed for whatever reason, the conversation about side effects is not always provided to individuals. And also the conversation about how long does something take to become effective. A lot of people think that, oh, I gave my kid their medicine on Monday. By Monday afternoon, I'm going to see some differences, and your body doesn't work that way. So get all the information you can about the medication that's being prescribed to your child, but then also talk to your doctor about what are those alternatives for my child if medication is not something that we're wanting to look into. And usually it's going to be somewhere around the types of foods that your child is eating.
Thank you very much. So well, I guess we've talked about when to seek help for our kids. What information should we provide to the school or the caregiver about a child's mental health?
Yes. And I think this is an important question because it's not something that we always think of, especially if we're talking about children who can't necessarily articulate what's going on. And again, the age doesn't matter. Sometimes our teenagers can't articulate what's going on with them. Make sure that, kind of taking it back to physical health, if you had a child with some physical health concerns and you were taking them to school, or you were taking them to childcare or daycare, or dropping them off at aunt and uncle's house, there are certain things that you would communicate to that individual, right? You would communicate, well, what's going on with them. You would communicate with them about if they are on medication, what medication they should take, how often they should take it, what the dosage amount is. And you would also communicate maybe a restriction in some activities or something, depending on their wellness. And I truly think the mental health part is the same. No, you don't have to go give them a whole long history of what's happened or what's going on with your child. But if there is going to be some behaviors or some concerns while your child is in the care, whether it's the school or whether it's that caregiver, make sure that you communicate with them what to expect of your child. If there is medication that they need to take while they're in their care, make sure you communicate that information as well. And then along the lines of food, if there's some foods that they should stay away from, make sure that you have communicated that information to your caregiver as well. Just kind of thinking through, if we're looking at behaviors in our children, and sometimes when we think of behaviors, we automatically think of negative behaviors, but I'm just thinking of all behaviors in general. Anytime we do something, it's a behavior, right? If there is something that triggers your child, make sure you've communicated that as well. That's not something that we always think about, but just to give a story, I worked with someone years ago who was was former military, and worked in a school. And he said that when he first started working in the school, during passing periods, when you have hundreds of kids in the hallway, it was a trigger for him. And he says, and he hadn't thought about it before working in a school, but he would retreat back to his classroom and he could not even be in the hallway because of what he saw when he was in the military. And the noise and the volume of people put him in a state where he was almost he was fearful, but almost to the point where he couldn't even move and do anything. And so sometimes there are things that happen, especially in a school, that may trigger a child, and your school needs to be aware of that. One other story I had recently in the last few years, unfortunately, you all hear about the school shootings that happen around the country. And we had a young man who was in another state, but was in a building when a shooter entered the building. And it was one of those national stories, and that family moved from that state into this area. And most schools, or all schools, are required to have fire drills, right? Every month you have to have a fire drill. State of Texas says so. And this day, it was a typical day, and they had their fire drill. Well, when the fire drill happens, the alarm goes off. But for this individual, for this student, that is what triggered students exiting that building where that shooting happened. And so for that student, hearing the fire drill brought back all of those memories and feelings of what was happening that day. And so the school didn't know it at that time, but in subsequent times, what the school did was, hey, Mr. and Mrs., we're going to have a fire drill on this day at this time. Please have your child stay home. And then once that is over, then you can bring your child to school. So it's sometimes those things we don't think about that can really trigger our children and put them in a place where they're not going to be well for the rest of the day.
Well, thank you very much. I have several questions, so let's go. All right, so what interventions are utilized when a child cannot be given out of school suspension due to them being kinder to third grade?
So what are some interventions that a school can provide?
Something besides school suspension, if the kid is in kinder to third grade.
So a lot of schools, so not just where I work, but a lot of schools are hiring what they call behavior interventionists. And what this individual can do is they can go into a classroom and kind of better understand what the behaviors are for the child. They're looking for what are the triggers that happen before we see a behavior that maybe is not one that we want to see in a classroom. And so our behavior interventionist, our behavior coach will work with the teacher to kind of help them to understand that child a little bit better, or they should be. I can't say what's happening in other schools, but help them to understand that child a little better. And then every school in the state of Texas has to have a school counselor. And so your school counselor, all parents are able to reach out to their school counselor at any time and say, you know what, this is what's happening with my child. Can you provide some support? And so your school counselor can pull that child in individually. They can do maybe some small group work with that child to really help them work on skills and develop stronger skills that we want to see to help negate some of those skills that maybe be not so positive.
All right, thank you. Next question says, are there networks or groups that you can recommend for single parents beyond pediatrician or a child's therapist?
Networks or groups. I did not prepare for a list of that, but I will say Google is our best friend. We can find anything on Google, but we can find anything on Google is also the problem. So I would still say, talk to your pediatrician. If your child already has a therapist, ask them for resources because they're going to have those agencies or those groups or those private practices that they've had people talk about that are going to be beneficial to children of different ages.
Thank you. And I have just dropped in the chat two kits that Integral Care and NAMI Central Texas put together. If you can all look into your chats, just click on that link and it's got a lot of resources and tools for this very question that we just answered. And that should be helpful. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. And I will also say, because I see something in the chat about parents with maybe low income, but I will say, still talk to your school. One of the beautiful things that have come out of COVID is most school districts have, of course, they all have a school counselor. So your school counselor can absolutely see your kid. That is 100% free. There should never be a time that you are paying anyone at any public school to see your child during the school day, whether it's a school counselor, behavior interventionist, a tutor, or anything. Public school resources are free for all students. So you should not be paying for any of that. But one of the things that came out of COVID was a highlight on children's mental health. I mean, for those of us working the profession, we knew there was a need way before COVID. After COVID, there's even a greater need, but then also our state officials, our country has really understood that there's a need for support, especially children, and especially our younger children. And so what the state of Texas has actually done is they have partnered with the University of Texas and Dell Children's Medical Center in this area, and then also other bigger universities and hospitals across the state, and providing services we call T-Chat, which in short is access to therapy online for free during the school day. And so while your school district may not have T-Chat as a program, they probably have access to some program that is very similar to that. Here in Round Rock, not only do we have T-Chat as one of our programs, again, during the day, online for our students, completely free, we have partnered with Bluebonnet Trails Community Services, which is the mental health authority for Williamson County, in our schools, and to do work with our students, again, for free in our schools. So when the school counselor feels like, the services that I can provide for this child are not enough to support what they need, our counselors, through work with our parents, will make a referral to our Bluebonnet Trails or to the T-Chat services, so that our kids are getting the therapy services they need or the psychiatric services they need, and it's all free. And I can tell you that Austin ISD has something very similar. If I'm not mistaken, are they working with Integral Care, Lady Dean?
They used to.
Okay, but they have something similar. Georgetown ISD has something very similar. So does Pflugerville and Leander. So all of the school districts in this immediate area, Hutto ISD has something very similar, have some type of program where not only our school counselors, our behavior interventionists, our social workers are housed in the schools working with our students, but those agencies, they have partnered with those agencies to provide low income support, but support for families for free.
Okay, well, that's good to know. And I do know that Integral Care used to work with one of the school districts. Now we still work with Del Valley, I believe, not AISD.
Okay.
All right, so back to our Q&A. There's a question here. How can I help my child who is 18 and has depression?
Yes, and that's kind of that age where they want to be on their own and kind of do their own thing, and may actually be more reluctant to getting support. Having those conversations with them about why we need to, we as mom, dad, aunt, uncle, whoever, and the child, while we need to address it now. So I don't remember the actual statistic, but I know that there is a very large percentage of individuals that from the first time they have a symptom of depression or anxiety to the time they get help is around 10 years. And when you think about that, and I don't know for this individual when the 18-year-old started having depression, or when that was even made aware to you all, but oftentimes the time from onset of symptom, that first symptom, to the time getting help is a very long time. It's multiple years. And so the earlier we can intervene and get the support, the more likely that their success is going to be move forward at a lot quicker pace. And so talking with your child about why it's important that we go get help, but then connecting your child to those resources. So Travis County Integral Care is your mental health authority. Williamson County, it is Bluebonnet Trails, who's your mental health authority. I would look at those two individuals depending on which county you're in. If you are employed, most employers have an employee assistance program, which will provide services to you and or your family for free for a certain number of sessions. It's usually about 6 sessions. But because your child is also 18, I would definitely walk alongside them in this path to connecting to resources, but I would also help them to understand how important it is for them to find a therapist or some type of program that's going to be a good fit for them, but also how they when they're not home with mom and dad any longer, how they can actually reach out and get help for themselves as well. 988 is a great number. It is the suicide prevention lifeline. They don't have to be suicidal to reach out to those individuals. They can text that number, they can call that number, and it's a national number, but they also, when they call that number, they're connected to people in the area.
Thank you. The questions keep coming. Okay, so next question. What do the public schools do for ADHD besides ask for parents to medicate their child? Or what should they do?
Yeah, and so it's really going to be dependent upon the school district, and it's also going to depend on what your child needs while they're in school. Most often, if your child's ADHD is to the point where it's disrupting their educational environment, where they may have a hard time being in the classroom to actually receive the instruction, you may see them be placed in a special ed underneath the special ed umbrella, which gives them access to additional resources. So that may be another individual that comes into the room to help them. It may be some social skills training that they are provided. And there's also another program called 504 that your child can be placed on, which will provide access to accommodations to kind of just help them to get on the path or stay on the path where they're the most successful.
Okay.
But I always default to school counselors. I mean, I'm the director of school counselors, so that's maybe just my job, but your school counselors can always help. Most school counselors have time where the students can come in and talk with them individually. They'll also have time where they do like small groups where it's maybe 4 to 6, maybe 8 students in a group working on some skills. There are parent liaisons in many school districts, and that is a person who works between the school and the parent, but also provides some parenting skills classes in conjunction with school counselors to help support the family in helping to support their child. So there's many different avenues. Of course, it's going to depend on your school district, but start with your school counselor, start with your child's teacher to ask about what other resources are available.
Thank you. Now, would you say the same thing for PTSD for a child?
Yes, and I would say if your child does have PTSD, when you enroll them in school, you might want to let your school counselor or the school know. So that's going to be the school counselor, the principal, sitting down and having a conversation with them. And that goes back to making sure that the school is aware of any triggers that your child may have, and also so they can make sure that they have a support plan in place for your child if needed.
All right, next question. What sort of care do you recommend for children traumatized either directly or indirectly by school shootings?
You know, that is a hard one because all of our kids still have to walk into those school buildings, right? They still
Right.
have to go to school. I can tell you what I've done with my own children after our recent tragedy in Uvalde. Um, my first conversation with them was, what is it that you know? What questions do you have? And speaking to them on their level. Now my kids are 5th grade and 8th grade again. But then also letting them know that, as you know, we may hear about them a lot in the news. So it may seem like it happens everywhere, every day, all the time. But the reality is that it is still very small in number when you start looking at the number of schools and the number of school districts. So helping them to put some of that into perspective. And some of that's going to depend, how much they understand is going to depend a little bit on their age and their development, but really just being open to them having that conversation with you, but helping them to understand that it is very rare. Just because we hear about something, doesn't make it something that's possible or plausible for them.
Okay, and that's a hard one.
That is a difficult one.
All right. Okay, so who pays for the behavior interventionist, the school or the parent?
So if you're in a public school, the behavior interventionist should be paid for by the public school. They're all salaried employees. So you should not be paying out of pocket for anything that happens, any services provided to your child in a public school.
All right, there's a question, actually a couple of them, about bullying. One says, how can parents and school authorities work together to curb bullying that is severely affecting my child's mental health?
So, and I will say this as a person who was also a classroom teacher, as someone who was a counselor on a campus. I think oftentimes adults and kids think that the teacher or the school may know what's happening because they're right there. There were things that happened in my classroom and the kids would come up to me and I'm like, oh, when was that? Because there's so much happening in a classroom. Our classrooms, if you're lucky, you have 20 kids or less, but they're usually 25 plus. And I worked in a middle school, and so it was even more than that. So I say all of that to say, talk to your school, let them know what's actually going on, because they may not be aware. The state of Texas requires that every single school district have a bullying prevention protocol in place. And so what that means is that as soon as the school is made aware, and that's usually the administrator or the principal on the campus or the assistant principal of that campus, that triggers what they call a bullying response. And so every school, they should be making sure that they do an investigation to understand what happened, what occurred. They should be talking to the student who was harmed. They should be talking to the student that potentially did the harm. And then they should also be following back up with the parent. They're probably not going to tell you if it was bullying, they're not going to tell you what the consequence for that other child was. But they still should be following up with you to assure you that it has been addressed. The state is also looking at providing or recommending that school districts have some type of bullying lesson or curriculum in their schools that all students receive. And so that will definitely be helpful. But I would also say reach out to your PTA or your PTO, your parent teacher association or your parent teacher organization, and talk to them about the need for some bullying curriculum. And they can work with you as a parent, and they can work with the school district to provide some bullying prevention lessons for students or some bullying prevention programs.
All right, follow-up question to that. What if you've reported and you're not getting the right responses from school authorities?
So, and maybe I should speak as a parent and not as a district employee, but you have the right to know what's going on with your child. You have every right to feel comfortable sending your child to school. Your child has every right to be safe while they're at school. And so if you feel like you have communicated with the school, you've talked to that principal and you are not getting satisfied results, everyone has a boss. And so if that principal has not given you what you need, then you can reach out to that principal's supervisor. And in most districts, that is either what they call either an area superintendent or a district chief, but that individual has a boss, and you can find that on your district website. And you can always go to the superintendent and say, these are the things that are happening on this campus, and it has not been addressed. So I would say this even as a district employee, if you have not gotten the satisfaction that you feel you need to ensure that your child is as safe as possible on any school campus anywhere, then don't stop having those conversations until you can get the results that you need. And I see in the chat, Anti-Defamation League is absolutely a good resource as well. The link is there in the chat. You may always contact them as well.
Thank you very much. A couple of questions more. So school will be closing soon. How can we support our children's mental health over the summer break?
Yes. Well, I think, you have to make sure you know your child best. And sometimes kids just need to be away from school and other people. And that will help them. So really identify what helps to fill your kid's bucket. Is it time alone? Because we don't value that a lot. Time alone can be really therapeutic. Do they need that time alone to kind of help rejuvenize and re-energize for the coming school year? But if they are someone who enjoys the company of others, maybe some summer camps. I will also say, if your child is medicated, we often see parents will remove the medication from their child because they're not at school, but that is not always what's in the best interest of your child physically. And so if you feel like that's a need or a desire, have that conversation with your doctor, because again, it's going to take some time to fully work its way out of your child, but it's also going to take some time to integrate back into your child once you start those medications again. When we're talking, if your child was seeing a therapist during the school year, see if you can continue to have those services during the school year, especially if it was tied to something that was happening on the campus, if it's through the child's campus. I know in Round Rock ISD, we still provide those services for our students if they're seeing someone through Bluebonnet Trails or T-Chat through the course of the summer for that consistency for the child. So talk to your school district to see if you can continue those services. If they are in therapy outside of school, continue those services as well. If you're planning on a trip or something like that, talk to your therapist to make sure you're working around that. And I know we're going to get to just general resources, but there are a lot of online agencies, a lot of online companies that provide therapy. One of the ones I really like is Talkspace. That is something for kids of all ages and adults. And it is online. So that means if you're here in the Austin area or you decide to go off to New York for the summer, your child still is connected to those services. But consistency is usually the key. So as we go into summer break, try to be as consistent as possible with your children.
Let me add this. There is another, it's the website. So it's a resource for us to add. It's called asklistentalk.org. And I just put a link in the chat. Asklistentalk.org. Okay, well, let's see what else we have. Okay, so this is another important question. And it says, how can you navigate the system of care in the school if you are an immigrant?
That is a great question. And most school districts are actually going to have a department that is strictly for helping people from other countries actually navigate school and then provide that support. So it is usually called a bilingual department. And sometimes we only think about that in context of language and getting language support, but there's so many programs within those. So it's either a bilingual department or an emergent bilingual department. Some districts house it under the big umbrella of state and federal because that's kind of where some of that money is coming from. It's coming from the state level, it's coming from the federal level. Doesn't really make sense, but that's usually where those departments lie. And they will have, most of those have programs directly related to supporting people who are coming from other countries, not only in just language, but how do you navigate the resources in school? How do you navigate the resources out in society too? Getting housing, making sure you have your utilities and your food and transportation. How do you support your child just in school in America? And so looking on your district's website for some of those words. So bilingual department, emergent bilingual department, or even looking under state and federal, because some of that information is going to lie underneath that big umbrella department.
Okay. Well, last two questions. The other one is more like a comment. It says, what can you do whilst you are waiting on a wait list?
So unfortunately, because there's been such a high need of support for children lately, and even again pre-COVID, there's just not a lot of therapists or agencies that work with kids of all ages. We see a large wait list for our younger kids, because sometimes people don't recognize that maybe my 4-year-old really does need therapy, and it's not their just rambunctious or whatever. There may be something there. And so there are a lot of wait lists right now. I would say get on that wait list, but then still continue to look for resources. And so you may be on 4 or 5 wait lists. Hopefully it doesn't take that many, but you may be on multiple wait lists, but continue until you find someone who's reputable, that can provide you the support that you need. And I'm actually going to drop in the chat. I found these 2 organizations that actually they're organizations, but they connect you to therapists in the area. There is a therapyforblackmen.org, and so it is national, and you can put in your address and it will connect you to therapists that work specifically with Black males. And then there's also a therapy for Black girls that does the exact same thing. So those are resources that you can reach out to. And then again, I would say, even if you're on multiple wait lists, still continue to talk to your child, continue to look for resources, but continue to talk to your child and make sure those avenues of communication are open. And again, sometimes talking doesn't mean actual talking. Sometimes kids want to text you, and make sure that's okay too.
Thank you very much. Any more resources to share? And everyone, we've put in a lot of resources in the chat, so you might want to copy them or something like that. But Dr. Lewis, do you have any more resources to share?
Well, you have provided Integral Care's information, but I'm going to throw it in the chat again. And then I'm also going to throw Bluebonnet Trails information in the chat. Again, Integral Care is your mental health authority for Travis County.
Travis County.
And Bluebonnet Trails is your mental health authority for Williamson County.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Any comments or any submissions from the audience? Going once.
I just wanted to thank you both for your time. So
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. Did I see another hand up? Willie? No?
Hi, thank you so much. I'm an educator as well here in Austin ISD. And so definitely I'm a witness to the fact that it's very much needed. And I emphasize the fact that wellness for our educators as well.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you. Absolutely. And I think sometimes we forget about that. And you know, that's a great point. So absolutely, educators, they do so much, but educators are adults, and we often focus as adults. We want to make sure our kids are well, whether that's the kids in your classroom or your biological kids or your nieces or nephews, grandchildren or whatever. But you cannot make sure they're well if you're not well. And so it is really important that as adults, we are taking care of ourselves so that we are there to take care of those little people in our lives, or sometimes they're bigger than us, but those younger people in our lives.
Well, thank you
Willie.
very much. Thank you, Dr. Lewis, for joining us this afternoon. Again, everybody else, it's been a wonderful conversation. We have a lot of resources in the chat. If you need them, I can email it to you because I have all your information. This forum happens every third Wednesday at 1:30. So be looking forward to the emails from me. Next week, we'll be talking about peer support in mental health. And I would love for you all to invite somebody else to join, and let's continue uplifting the Black community and, most importantly, taking care of our mental health. So until we meet again next month, please be well and be safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.